So we have with us today Ira Mukhoty, and she's an author who's written these delightful accounts of the Mughal Empire, of the empresses, queens, and begums of the Mughal Empire. That is the book that we are going to be discussing today, Daughters of the Sun. So let me show the book on the screen as well. And she's also written a couple of other books which are equally very interesting, but today we're going to be focusing on the women of the Mughal Empire. So welcome, Ira.
Thank you so much. I'm so pleased to be part of the festival this year.
Yes, we wish we could have had you in Lahore, but maybe next year. So this book is such a delightful account of the lives of the women and the intricacies of the zenana and the harem, the Mughal harem and the Timurid harem also. So I was thinking, before we launch into the Mughal harem, could we, perhaps you could just sort of explain or introduce the Timurid women to us and the Timurid traditions and the culture of the harem amongst them.
Yes, absolutely, because I think that's one of the fundamental things to understand when we talk about the Mughal women. So going back all the way to Babur, really, when he in 1506 he pays a visit to Herat. At that time, I think it was Sultan Mirza Bekara, the last independent ruler of Herat. He's trying to get support. His father has died. He's a very young man. He's just a boy, really. And he realizes that the Uzbeks have surrounded Herat, and this last of the Timurid kings is about to fall. So from that moment, Babur has this realization that he is actually the last surviving prince, independent prince of the Timurids, this great lineage that claims descent from Timur themselves. So for the next many years that he lives and founds this empire in India, first in Kabul, then in Agra, he really has this sense of a homeland lost and a homeland that he is trying to recreate in Hindustan. And not only Babur, but all his descendants, at least the six great Mughals, will cling to this idea of a Timurid homeland. Which is why in Babur we see that he has actually in himself managed to associate some of the characteristics of both the nomadic Turco-Mongol steppe heritage that he has, and the sedentary Perso-Islamicate one that he has these two strands in himself. So we see various elements when he starts establishing his empire. We see a love for walled gardens, for example, coming from the Persian side. We see a love for Turki language. He writes his biography in Turkey. We see a love of Persian poetry, but also we see the support and patronage of Naqshbandi sheikhs, for example. So we see these various things which tie back to the lineage of both the Persian side that they were, increasingly trying to, bring into their court, but their Timurid inheritance. And part of the Timurid inheritance is this legacy of independent, politically powerful women who are very important in the process of empire formation. And right down the line, the Mughals of Hindustan will cling to this idea of women being very, very important. We see it right from the time of Timur himself. There's a Spanish ambassador who goes to Timur's court, way back in the 15th century, just before the death of Timur. And he writes back to, the Spanish court and says, he participates in many festivities, in songs and drinking activities, and he sees the wife of Timur and she's clearly visible. She is veiled, but it is a very transparent veil, and she is very much part of the negotiations, the conversations, the poetry, even the drinking. So he writes all this down. And so we have, right from the time of Timur, this idea that women are very much part of the process of creating the symbolisms around empire formation, around, obviously reproductive functions, and over this guardianship that they have over the legacy of the Timurids. And therefore, it is something that is there right from the time of Babur, and which is sometimes very astonishing to us here in Hindu.
Right.
Hindustan because we've got the legacy of Europeans writing about the Mughal court. And so they come with their own, background of prejudice and bias because they're writing from their experience of the Crusades and the various violent encounters that they have. So we hear about a harem which is very opaque, where the women are sort of locked up and they are degraded and they don't do much with their lives. Whereas actually, the truth is very, very complex and quite different from the one that we are given.
And so now, moving on to the actual women who populated this harem and who were also very active in the day-to-day life. They traveled with the men. They were also involved in, as we read through your account, some of the political negotiations as well, or the power struggles that were going on. So amongst these women, who were the women who truly stand out in the early period of the...
There are quite a few women. In fact, all the ones who are related to the emperor were very... In fact, I think we have a slide. I could talk you through some of the women. If we can show, not my cover, but the first slide that we have on the presentation. It shows us one of the, I think it is in fact considered one of the earliest datable Mughal paintings. It comes from 1545, of the time of Humayun.
Is it the cover for the Daughters of the Sun, or is this...
No, this image for a long time had been called Humayun and his brothers in a garden landscape. Because as you will see in the bottom third of the painting, there is in fact Humayun. He's been identified, and I think there's Hindal next to him, and Hindal is holding out a portrait of the young Prince Akbar at this time. But what a scholar called Laura Parodi has shown is that actually there are also a lot of women in the image who have been not talked about as much as they should have been. And she points to the figures, firstly, of women in the left-hand side of the painting, where there's a group of 5 women, and she has individually identified them through the use of the color of the clothes they're wearing. So the green denotes the mother of Akbar, Hamida Banu Begum, who was a very important woman. Some of the other women are probably Gulbadan Begum, sister of Babur, and there is Bega Begum, Humayun's primary wife. And on the upper right-hand side, 2 other women in slightly different clothes, and those are the angas, or foster mothers of Akbar. And they are sort of hovering over the figure of young Akbar playing with a friend. And so this scholar has actually pointed out to the fact that these women in this landscape show a completely different side to the painting. And she has proposed that this is a site which still exists outside Kabul today. It is related to fertility, to rituals around fertility for women. So it is a site which actually celebrates the reproductive power of women. This painting is now thought to symbolize the festivities which happened after the circumcision of Akbar. And so this brings us to a very important point, that all these women who are painted individually here in this very early painting of, when the Mughal Empire was just about forming here in Hindustan, it means that all these women are playing a primary role in the birthing of Akbar, in looking after him at a time of great vulnerability, of ensuring around him the great traditions of the Timurid legacy. And among them, so we have, as I was saying, Hamida Banu Begum is extremely important. We know from the very first writings about her that she's educated, she's quite headstrong, she knows her own mind. She finally, marries Humayun after much persuasion, spends 2 years in Persia with him, comes back to Hindustan, and then, Humayun dies very quickly. And then it is Hamida Banu Begum who looks after the interest of her son relentlessly. She is always there at times of vulnerability. She is there along with the other women like Gulbadan Begum and even the foster mothers, and they're always there to ensure that things are going the right way for Akbar. For example, in the first few years, it is Behram Khan, Akbar's great Khan Khanan, who actually holds power, because Akbar is extremely young. Humayun had already, he was an important general with Humayun, and when Humayun dies, Behram Khan is a very talented general, and he comes to the fore. But after a few years, the women realize that he's actually taking on rather too much power. He's appointing his own men instead of the ones he should be appointing, and they realize that things have gone a little too far. And they mount what is pretty much acknowledged to be a coup by the harem. So all the women together persuade Akbar, who was too busy at that time with hunting and the cheetahs and the elephants and all those kind of activities. And they talk to him and they bring him to his senses almost. And they say, listen, this is a time of now, to test your strength and you have to stand up to Begum Khan. They mount this coup. They come to Delhi, all of them, and all the great armies join them one by one. And Begum Khan finds himself isolated and he understands he's been undone by the women. So you see, in a very subtle way, they are always there negotiating politics from their space in the harem. So all these women in various ways were extremely important.
In particular, would you like to tell us a bit about Khanzada Begum as well? Because she,
Yes.
at the
Absolutely,
was one of the women who actually
yes.
helped
So
Babur.
there it was. Absolutely. So there's an image. I think it's the second one after that we have just shown. It's a folio showing Khanzada Begum sitting in on a dais in front of Babur. So this is an extraordinary image. It is pretty rare for a woman to be shown so clearly in these Mughal manuscripts. The large proportion of them, the majority of them, about men and their activities. So when a woman is shown in such a central position, it clearly shows a woman of great authority. And this is from the Akbarnama, and it shows an episode that happens very early on in the Mughal Empire. So Babur, when he was trying to, hang on to Samarkand at that time, he finds himself besieged by Shaybani Khan Uzbek, whose power is rising at that time in Central Asia. And Babur is reduced to just a few men. His entourage is decimated, and he has almost nothing left. And he's coming to a point of desperation. I believe they're eating the dogs and the horses in the city. And Shaybani Khan Uzbek comes to him. He sends a proposal, and he says, "I will allow you to leave with your men, whoever you have left in your entourage, but you leave your eldest sister with me, Khanzada Begum." Who's an unmarried woman at that time. And Babur is forced to do this. And Khanzada Begum is married to this dreaded and loathed enemy, Shaybani Khan Uzbek. She stays in marriage 10 years. She's finally married to a second man. And when Shaybani Khan Uzbek is defeated in the end by the Persians, Khanzada Begum is sent back to Babur's court. And what is extraordinary to me, from the perspective of Hindustan and the way in which here we put so much value on a woman's sexual chastity, for me it was very amazing to realize that Khanzada Begum, who returns after being forcefully kidnapped and married to two men, is received at Babur's court with so much love and affection that she made Padshah Begum of the harem. She is made the most respected senior woman whose word will be taken, who will advise all the other women, who will be in control of negotiations. So this was very, very interesting to me. The fact that as a childless woman, she has no son to prop up her name, yet we find that because these Timurid women value women so much through their own bloodline, it doesn't matter whether or not she has a son, that is of no consequence. So if we compare, the other day I was studying, I'm looking at the Nawabs of Awadh, for example. And in the Nawabs of Awadh, the Shia Nawabs, if we look at somebody like Wajid Ali Shah, so he had this system, as we know, of Pari Khana, where he had many courtesans who used to be great singers and dancers. And if they were very good, then they became Paris. They were known as Paris. So we have, for example, Hazrat was first Hazrat Pari. She got the designation. Then when she, got pregnant and had a son, then she was allowed to be called Hazrat Mahal, and she was allowed to veil herself and live in seclusion. So the Begum could only happen after she had a son. And I was thinking back to this and thinking, my goodness, in the 16th century, it didn't matter if these women were married, unmarried, childless or not, whether they had sons or daughters. It is the women themselves who were respected. And so they were respected not solely clearly for their reproductive potential, because Khanzada never had a son, to her name, but they were respected because of the moral authority they had as Timurid women. Khanzada Begum not only serves as a great advisor to Babur, she's used as a diplomat. He sends her on ambassador missions whenever his brothers oppose him, which is later on when his brothers oppose Humayun. She is sent as an ambassador. And she also organizes organizes very specific Timurid activities. So she organizes something called the Mystic Feast in Agra after Humayun's coronation. And, she's the one who makes sure that they're correct objects, the swords, the pen and quills, the brocaded cloths, the illumination. So she is the one who decides how this feast will manifest the glory of Humayun in Hindustan. So these women have a very fundamental role in the creation of this Timurid Mughal legacy.
And now coming to Gulbadan, who's another very interesting figure in this, and you have used her as one of your primary sources for the book. She traded, and she went on this Hajj pilgrimage, which went on for 4 years, and again was welcomed back with great aplomb by by Emperor Akbar, who sent. So could you elaborate a bit on the fact that how much power, how much influence she wielded, like the incident at Surat when her ship wasn't being allowed to sail forth and.
Yes. That's right. So Gulbadan is also an extraordinary character, and so she comes to Hindustan, I think, when she is 5 or 6 years old. But she's very soon, so she writes about that time, very vividly, even though she was so small. And she writes about her memories of Babur, and then Babur dies, and then she lives, of course, under the reign of Humayun and later Akbar. So she has a very long life, and is able to, as you said, when Akbar decided that it's in the 1570 that it's time for Akbarnama to be written, a great history of his reign, in his legacy. He calls on Gulbadan, amongst others, to write down her memoirs of this time with whatever she remembers of Babur Humayun. So already there we see what great worth he puts, what great store he puts by her memories as a tired woman. And in the 1570s, she goes on this extraordinary voyage. I think we don't hear of any such a resplendent Hajj voyage as the one carried out by Gulbadan Begum. She comes to Akbar one day and says that it has been my heart for many years to carry out this Hajj pilgrimage. And Akbar tries to dissuade her because he's very fond of this aunt of his, and things are very dangerous, in the waters because of the Portugals. And the Portuguese have been, pirates in the seas between India and Mecca, and they have been seizing ships, and they've been creating all sorts of, terror on the seas. And they control all the ships which leave Surat for Mecca. And you have to carry this kartaz, or a pass, which has on it the Virgin Mary. So it is a cause for great nation by the ladies that they have to carry a kartaz with the Virgin Mary's image on it. So that is the first point that Gulbadan finds very annoying. And then she is held up for 1 year in Surat as negotiations go on. And she is so annoyed by all this that when she earns, after many years, she tells the people of Buxar to mount a rebellion against the Portuguese, and she cries bitterly to Akbar about them. But the fact remains that for 7 years, it is a total of 7 years from the time she leaves the court of Akbar to the time she returns. And it is an extraordinary time, where she spends 3 full years in the Holy Lands. She goes for all these pilgrimages, and she distributes so much wealth that she creates almost furore around her. And the Sharif of Mecca has to complain to Akbar and say, listen, please call back your Mughal ladies, because they're creating a lot of pandemonium here in the Holy Lands, and beggars are coming from everywhere looking for largesse. But I find it so wonderful. She, clearly had such a great time representing, Emperor Akbar in Mecca, and took a long time to come back. And when she comes back, she meets up, of course, with Hamida Banu, who has stayed to remain by Akbar's side. And very soon after this, the Jesuit missionaries who were staying in Agra, in Fatehpur Sikri at that time, they soon leave. These Mughal ladies make their lives intolerable. They keep complaining to Akbar that, how dare they tell you to repudiate all your wives except one? What kind of men are these? And they make their lives so intolerable that the Jesuits leave very soon after Gulbadan returns to court. So she has a more subtle influence, but she's there almost throughout Akbar's life, and he holds a lot of store by her advice.
And all of these women, we also read in your account that a lot of them had their own ships which they would use for trading purposes, and the various emperors would give them rights to various jagirs, and so they had independent earning sources. So,
Yes.
was there a system by which they sort of took control of the income that was coming in, and they used it, and did they have people they had hired, managers or accountants? Or
Yes.
how was that
Exactly.
in place?
So this is exactly as you were saying. They actually had so the harem is one of I think the most misunderstood spaces, at least here in India. We used to think of it as this chaotic, rambunctious, fractious place where these women are always fighting with each other. It was not at all like that. It was a very orderly space, almost like a bureaucratic government institution. And all these women who were in that space, they had a particular job for which they were paid. So it was, since it was run like a government institution, you had managers, you had a budget, you had accountants, all women. You had administrators, and they were running all the different aspects, the food, the clothing, what the women wanted to do, the entertainment, what activities they were carrying on. Everything was recorded and written down. And these women, the Mughal women, all the people who carried out these functions had specific roles, and they had a specific income. All of them, from the most simple basic job to the highest noblewoman, they all had a fixed income. Now half of this income came straight from the treasury, they were paid in cash, and half came from the jagir, the lands that they owned, revenue generating lands that they owned. In addition to this, especially for the higher ranked women, you had many occasions during the year when you were given gifts by the emperor and by all the noblemen who wanted to be in your good graces. So they would gift the women expensive jewelry, other incentives for their birthdays, for feasts, for Navroz, at the end of a hunt, at the end of a military campaign. So throughout the year, the women were increasing their wealth through these many sources. In addition to the fact that especially the elite women inherited wealth. For example, when Mumtaz Mahal died, she gave half her wealth to her daughter Jahanara. And Mumtaz Mahal was a very wealthy woman. So there were these many sources of income that the women had, and they could use it as they saw fit. So some of them would use it for charity, some would give alms to deserving men, some would commission great buildings like Jahanara did, some would commission poetry, and some would then increase their wealth even more by trading. So for example, Harkabai, Maryam Uz-Zamani, Akbar's wife, Jahangir's mother, she was a great tradeswoman. And she had all these indigo farms in Bayana in Rajasthan. And she had even built a step well just to make sure that there was enough water for this very precious, plant, which used to generate so much wealth for the Mughal Empire at that time. Indigo was very, very, searched after commodity all over the world. So she had this precious, farm of indigo. And she had a ship. It's the Rahimi was her ship, and it was solely her. Everyone knew this was the Queen Mother's ship. I think it was the biggest ship to sail the Hajj waters at that time. It was a 1,500-ton ship. And so it carried not only goods, but also Hajj pilgrims. So it would go to the Holy Lands, carry goods and pilgrims, and then come back with different goods and bringing back the pilgrims. And I think in 1612, this ship, the Queen Mother's ship, was seized by the Portuguese. As I was mentioning, they were constantly creating trouble, trying to create trouble for the Mughals. But Harkabai, Maryam Uz-Zamani, was so infuriated by the fact that they had seized her great ship, and nobody else would have dared to do that. The English write in their report that the Portuguese have got into a lot of trouble because they have seized the Queen Mother's ship. And she went to Jahangir and complained bitterly. And Jahangir was so incensed by this action against his mother that he closed the churches which Akbar had commissioned and allowed to, spring up everywhere. He closed trade for them. He did not allow them to trade any longer. He seized some of their towns, and basically he made conditions so difficult for the Portuguese that really that was the end of them in India, and it would be the British and the Dutch who would come up next. So in a way, this Rajput woman brought about the end of the Portuguese, at least trading in that area. So the women had a lot of money, and they could invested. They had middlemen, women who were carrying out the role of middlemen. They would go and talk to the Europeans. So all this work was being carried out in parallel to the government. So it was like a shadow government, if you like, carried out by the women from the harem to the outside world.
Very interesting. But now we come to the transition from like the Timurid harem or the zenana to the actual Mughal imprint on the harem, and in particular during Akbar's reign, when he married a lot of the Rajput princesses, we see that there's a slightly different complexion being given to the zenana of
Right.
harem. Could you please, shed some light on that, in particular with that chastity element
Yes.
that comes in, with the women being given titles and the names of the women being kept, in the shadow,
Right.
not.
So that was something which actually, perplexed me for a long time. Is that initially when we saw the early Mughal women, and somebody called Ruby Lal has done a lot of, she's a scholar. She's done a lot of groundbreaking work on the early Mughal harem. She's written a scholarly book on this, which really helped me a lot in writing my book. So I saw that we could see that the early women had so much freedom. There was no idea of a fixed space because they were always like the semi-nomadic kings. They were accompanying them everywhere. There was no question of them being kept in one town, in one city, in one palace. There was no such thing. They were in tents on horseback, going from place to place, from battle to battle, from pilgrimage, on visits, whatever the kings were doing, they were doing alongside them. And as we saw with the example of Khanzada Begum, no question of their chastity being the most important thing about them. Their value was as Timurid women far greater in terms of all the inputs they could give to the empire. So there was no question of them being blamed for their sexual chastity being in any way dishonored, you see. But what is very curious is that by the time of Akbar, this changes completely. Now, partly this has to do with the fact that the reign of Akbar itself undergoes this change alongside Abu al-Fazl, who is creating this notion of a great semi-divine king who is absolutely above the ordinary mortal compulsions and degradations and vices. So he in his Akbarnama, he almost single-handedly creates a space and makes the entire government and the country into an extreme, what he would like to be an extremely ordered place. Because if the king is perfect and semi-divine, then there should be equal harmony and perfection in the empire, including the harem. So he writes about the harem. He's the first to write about the harem in terms of a very ordered space, and no longer, because the king himself is so exalted, his women are even more so. So you can no longer even take their name. You cannot see them with your eyes. You can only use their titles. They're all, as you said, given titles, Maryam Makani and Maryam Zamani. Their names are almost completely obliterated from the record. So this is partly because of this time that around Akbar especially, that there's this desire for very ordered space which is above reproach. At the same time, Akbar was marrying all these Rajput women. Now, as we know from that time, the Rajasthan was not a place where we had these settled states. It was a place of constant warring, of fractious tribes, of brother fighting against brother, of a lot of warfare. Already the Rajput had a history of warfare. So what had happened in that is that you had these tight bands of brotherhood, or bhai beta clans, where all your tikanedars and your followers were bound to follow you unto death if you were in battle. And these battles happened all the time. So what happened was that when battles happen onto death is that you lose all these men. So you need quickly to have more sons and more men. So polygamy became rampant in the Rajput houses. They started to have many wives so that you could have many sons, raise armies around them, and go to battle time and time again. Now, the question of polygamy brought about this tricky problem of what happens to the chastity of the women. And so slowly the women became enclosed in a parda, in a fixed space, the zenana of the Rajputs. So the Rajputs already had this system of the zenana with very high walls, women hidden behind those walls. In fact, their idea of chastity became so extreme. For example, I read, in this book by Rima Huda, that there was a case where a marriage proposal was sent to a neighboring chieftain, and along with the proposal, they sent a coconut, to represent the bride, and said, "This is what we are, we want our daughter to marry into your house." At that time, in that chieftain's house, the son who was supposed to be marrying this woman had gone on war. So the father receives the coconut and he says, "Oh, my hair is too gray for this kind of proposal. My son will marry your daughter." But when the son comes home, he says to his father, "You have cast eyes upon this coconut, which symbolizes my bride, so I cannot marry her." you must marry her. So imagine the extent to which it had gone in terms of chastity, in terms of purity, in terms of how impossible it was for these women to be seen, outside the enclosed space. So these two worlds of the Mughals and the Rajputs, when they intermingle, they sort of cross-pollinate each other with this idea that elite behavior is parda. So both of them become even more fixed in this notion that as we become elite, the Rajputs also were like, okay, now that we are marrying into the Mughal house, we are very elite. We must adopt even further this elite behavior of parda and excessively keeping your women hidden. The Mughals with Akbar also started saying, yes, this is because Akbar was a very young man at that time when he saw his Rajput noblemen, the great noblemen who were marrying their daughters into his family. He started emulating this elite behavior and started also, decreeing that these women would be hidden, their chastity was important. They all became known as very chaste women, the youngest to the oldest, and it sort of became very established at this time. So you see, a huge change around the reign of Akbar.
However, the women still held a lot of these positions, and they were able to do a lot of things, as we see later on with Jahanara and then Aurangzeb's daughter Zebul Nisa, that they were able to exercise influence. Their influence does not, I mean, do you think the influence did not get any lessened by
Yes.
change in, let's say, the arrangement of the zenana?
Correct. No, as you say, it is really the arrangement which changes. It is not actual power. In fact, even the arrangement is more an idealistic idea of what Abul Fazl and Akbar have wanted. Often when they write certain things, it is actually to show that the opposite is happening. So, for example, when I remember a decree by Akbar where he says, it is very unbecoming for a woman to marry somebody who's 10 years old, for a man to marry a woman who's 10 years older to her. I forbid it from the empire. Clearly, the fact is that was happening. You have to forbid something, it means it was happening in the empire. So I think they were not quite as successful as they hoped, even with the women. And if we look now, I don't know if you will be able to show this image. It is further down. It is called a Kumarga hunt.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I find this extremely fascinating because if you look at it, so this is okay. So it's a particular type of hunt called the Kumarga hunt, which is very fascinating in itself. It is also of Timurid in its background. It is something that the emperors used to sort of strike terror in all their enemies because it was such a long-winded, vicious sort of display of their martial prowess. So what would happen you would have this huge circumference of land which was cordoned off, and the king was in the middle of all these animals. So first the king would hunt, and then the great noblemen would come and hunt with him, then the lower rank soldiers, and in the end all the soldiers were allowed into this huge circle and allowed 2-3 days to kill the animal. So this was a very violent place. And the last person you would expect here was a woman. But if you look in this image, in the painting, very clearly, so you see Akbar in the center on his horse, and he's chasing all these deers. But in the middle are the tents, the red tents of the women, and when the description happens, nobody says that the women were also there in the middle of this circle. Only the painter's showing this to us. The women are accompanying the king, even on this, what is a very, very, brutal display of power. You can see that there's a Khaja Sara sitting at the entrance. There's a woman who's talking to him. There's somebody inside. They are carrying on their lives as normal. So that great sequestration that Abul Fazl talks about, that the women are in Fatehpur Sikri and they're very hidden, and there's a matron guarding them, and there are eunuchs guarding them, and there are Rajput soldiers guarding them. Actually, it is not as simple as that, because wherever Akbar went, even the women accompanied him, and Akbar was always touring. He was always in the battlefield. He was always visiting other parts of his empire. These women are going there with him all the time. And an extraordinary thing is that the king, especially Akbar, we are told, spends 6 hours in the harem every day. Now, when the Europeans talk about it and tell us, oh, this king went off into the harem, the subtext is that he is only involved in sexual activities. But the fact is that is actually not at all the case. The harem is a place of safety for the emperor. It is the one place where he knows his life is not in danger. The food will be safe. He can sleep safely without anybody threatening his life. It's where seals of empire are kept. It's where the treasures are kept. So it's a place of great safety and secrecy for the emperor. It is where all his spies come and give him all the rundown on what the princes are up to, who's drinking too much, who's doing what, who's getting up to what behavior, which armies are thinking of rebellion. And the women hear all this information. So it is also a place of knowledge and power, and where they discuss all these things, and where the women come to the king with all their various requests. They will come for the favor to bring some particularly deserving woman into the harem. So this is the sort of thing that happens in the harem, and it happens wherever the king is, which you can see in this painting. So not only on hunts, but at almost all throughout the year, where the king is where the women are, and they have this interaction constantly.
And the other thing, can we talk a little about the milk mothers? The two very strong women in particular, in Akbar's case, because he was left in their care for such a long time while his parents were on the run, and then sought refuge in Persia. So do you feel in the course of your research, did you feel that there was any sort of a power struggle between these very strong women who came to look after this young child, and who later on became an emperor at a very young age, and the blood relatives, the women who were actually the royal women? And
so that's an interesting point, actually. So the first woman to get a lot of power at this time, when Akbar was left, by his parents, is Mahamanga. So we are told by all that she's there by Akbar's side all the time, physically present, and she even physically saves him at one point when he's being exhibited by his, uncle Kamran on the walls of the fort. So she is looking after his physical safety all the time. So she becomes a very powerful woman, and she is an ambitious woman. So when they finally established themselves in Agra, and then Delhi and Agra at the same time, really, she is the one who starts wielding power the first. Bayram Khan, has already exceeded his power, so he's been taken down, and it is Mahamanga for a while who is very, very powerful. The writers, contemporary historians, very clearly say this, that she is the one who wields power like a man. So I see no struggle between her and the blood relatives, because there is no clashing of objective. For Mahamanga, it was very clear that without the king, she is no one. Her power comes from her closeness to Akbar, and she would never dream of crossing that line. Okay. And so there's an understanding with the blood mothers that this woman, this foster mother, only has the best interest of Akbar, because that is where her power also comes from. So there is never any question. But where the problem does come is between two great foster families. So apart from Mahamanga, there is another foster mother who is very beloved of Akbar. That's Jiji Anga. So we don't hear about her in the chronicles independently, because she doesn't seem to have been a very ambitious woman. We don't see any buildings commissioned in her name, unlike Mahamanga, who commissions the Khairul Manazil Mosque and Madrasa complex in Delhi. Jiji Anga never does any such thing, but her entire family become extremely powerful. So she has a son called Mirza Aziz Koka, who is famously stubborn and sort of critical Amirs. He was one of the few people who can criticize Akbar in the open court and get away with him, because Akbar says that there's a river of milk between us. He calls upon this affection that he has for Jiji Anga. So Jiji Anga's family become very ambitious, and they clash with Mahamanga's family, and that is when the trouble comes up, because in a way you can say that these milk mothers are at the same level, but they never clash with the blood relatives, because they know that their power only comes from them and would never dream of crossing that line.
Excellent. Another thing that comes to mind when you're reading this account is about the position of power and influence that both Jahanara and Zebun-Nisar respectively hold in their father's court. And Jahanara in particular, and the support that she is to her brother Dara Shikoh, and how she supports him till the very end, and is also then has to pay a price for that and goes into imprisonment with the father. And in the same case, we see in the case of Zebun-Nisa, where she also tries to, side with the brother against her father, the Emperor Aurangzeb. Now, here were these women who we find were very well educated, very well trained in every manner, were right at the sides of their fathers, respective fathers, in the corridors of power in a way. But what sort of comes to my mind is that how come these women do not want power per se for themselves, and why did they just do it in support of their brothers? And their sort of Western counterparts, why did they not vie for power themselves? Why could they not become an empress, let's say, or whatever?
Yes, that's a good point. And, not just in the West, but I was reading a very interesting book called The Queens of Jerusalem. And we have this writer, Catherine Pangonis, has written about this 12th century world, in Jerusalem, around Jerusalem, where the women were actually queens in their own name, and they sought power and grabbed it, and they were able to get it. But this didn't happen, in the Mughals at all. I don't see the instant of any woman trying to get power for herself. The closest one could say was Nur Jahan, but there was never any question of her being on her own. She was, Jahangir's consort, and therefore had a lot of power. The minute he's out of the question, and Shah Jahan comes to power, she goes away to Lahore, and we don't hear of her again. So the power of these women and actually their role in the making of this Timurid imperial being in India is to really support the claims of one particular son or brother. It is to look after that claim and make sure that, it's an empire which has really been made out of nothing almost in India. When Babur comes, he has very little claim to this land. He has very few people with him. And as I was saying, they have this idea of a homeland that they need to recreate, of a lost great homeland that they need to build in India. So there's never any question, let us say, of the women adding to the chaos of the empire during succession struggles. On the other hand, their power comes from bolstering up a particular son or a brother. I don't think it would ever have been in their best interest to become yet another person who claims for the throne and thereby causes instability in the empire. So in a way, they know that their power comes from supporting someone, and when that person comes to power, for example, Jahanara loses everything when Dara Shikoh dies, and she goes into exile with her father for some years. Yet when when Shah Jahan passes away, he brings back Jahanara, and she once again becomes Pacha Begum. So I think they are quite aware of the fact that this empire is something that must be protected at all costs from these succession troubles. And so their job and their power comes from ensuring that, not creating one more candidate for the throne.
Okay, so there is a clarity of thought on that particular.
I believe so, yes.
Okay, so then we also have this whole city that was built, the new city, Shah Jahanabad, and you particularly mentioned the role of women in the building of the city, particularly Jahanara and her sister also laid a garden over there, and how there's this cluster of buildings in a certain area which were all done by women with their own money, with the earnings that they got. So could you put some light on that?
Yes, definitely. So, Shah Jahan was the great city builder of all the Mughals, and he just decided, to leave Agra one day and build this brand new city, Shah Jahanabad, in Delhi. But what was extraordinary when I started looking at this was the fact that apart from the Qila-e-Mualla, the Red Fort, and the outer walls, and the Jama Masjid, these are the great buildings that Shah Jahan sponsors. The rest he leaves to his daughters, his wives, and his noblemen. Now, this I was very, very taken aback by, because so many of these buildings, unfortunately, today have been destroyed. A lot were destroyed post 1857, by the British. And I think even that is quite symbolic, because the British, when they took back, the city, after the uprising, they actually they had been shocked by the way people rallied to the name of the Mughal Empire. They thought by then the Mughal emperor and the Mughal Empire was done in people's minds, and they would not rally to his cause. So they were shocked and horrified that the name of the Mughal emperor still carried so much weight with both the Hindus and the Muslim Sipahis. So they wanted to actually destroy all the visible remnants of their grandeur. And in this destruction, a lot of the buildings by the women were destroyed. But the fact is that after Shah Jahan built whatever he was building, the women take over, the daughters and the sisters, And Jahanara in particular builds this huge boulevard, the Chandni Chowk, with where all the traders come and lay out all their wares, and there's this beautiful canal in the middle, and there is a chowk in the middle, and she builds hammams on one side and a great caravanserai on the other side. And similarly, Roshnara built some buildings. The wives of Shah Jahan also built buildings. So this was something that I found very interesting. And if you compare them with their exact contemporaries, for example, in Isfahan, the women there were also building buildings, but they are very different in scale and in type from the Mughal women. So the Mughal women clearly had way more wealth than their counterparts elsewhere. So they were able to build a great deal more than anyone else, in the Islamic world. Also, their buildings are surprisingly secular. They don't simply build mosques, but they also build caravanserais, they build gardens, they build marketplaces. And lastly, even unmarried daughters of the emperor take up buildings which are then named after them, whereas in the other cities, it is only the wives who are allowed to carry out such buildings. So yes, Shah Jahanabad is a great example actually of the power of the Mughal women.
Okay, so I think with this we've managed to cover quite a bit of what you've brought to us of this gorgeous world, which is populated by these very talented, well-educated, well-trained and powerful women. And it's just given us a great insight into their lives also. And thank you so much for taking time out today to talk to us about it. And hopefully we should continue next year with your next book, perhaps.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.